Started. Okay, well, my name is Jake Mulder. I am the Executive Director of Leadership Formation for Fuller Theological Seminary. I am also the Senior Director of Strategy for the Fuller Youth Institute. And Fuller Seminary is based in Pasadena, California. We're one of the largest multi-denominational seminaries in the world. I happen to be based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I commute back and forth. Right now, I'm actually coming to you live from California, and it is very good to be with you. In this session, we're going to talk about how we can grow young together, and I want to introduce you to discover churches that young people love. And I will tell you a little bit more about what all of those terms mean in a minute. I do want to say this is more a breakout approach than it is a keynote talk or a main stage talk. So I would love to keep this as interactive as possible. I realize that it presents challenges when we can't see each other and interact in that way as easily. But I would love for you to either chat in questions as you have them or put questions in the Q&A, and I will pause periodically to respond to those. So with that, I am going to go ahead and share my slides. And there we go. And I'm going to assume that someone will tell me if you cannot see my slides. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that you are able to see them. The question that I want to begin our presentation here with is asking, what does the future of your church look like? And I want you to picture your church as it is now. Go ahead and just get a snapshot in your mind. And then I want to invite you to fast forward that snapshot 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And I want you to think about, given the most natural course of events where your church seems to be headed, what your church is going to look like at that point. Now, there's a lot of factors that could weigh in. There's the natural aging that may occur of your congregation. There's new people who might come in. When I did this exercise a year or two ago, we didn't even have some of the realities we're facing now of the pandemic, and have we all moved to virtual church, or are we meeting in person? But whatever that looks like for you, I want you to consider what you think the future of your church will look like. And then I want to invite you, especially if your picture is dark, if it's gray, if it's dim, if it's marked by mostly an older contingent who's part of the church, or a smaller congregation, or people who are divided and split based on their beliefs or generation. I want to invite you to consider a picture of what an intergenerational church might look like. I want you to picture your church, but it's not younger and older generations separated. It's younger and older generations mixed together. Depending on your tradition, it's hands held high in worship, or maybe people with their eyes closed or looking forward, politely engaged in worship. But it is younger, older, and everyone in between, engaged, connected in vibrant community, standing in worship before God. Now, I share that picture because I have seen that picture in hundreds of churches across the United States. At the Fuller Youth Institute, our prayer for young people and all people in the church is Jesus's prayer in John 10:10. Jesus's words where he says, I have come that they may have life and they may have it to the full. Now, I'm sure that a full life may look different based on your tradition or your location. But my hope and prayer for younger generations and all generations in the church is that they would come to know the full and abundant life that Jesus offers. Now, I said that I work for Fuller Seminary. Here's a snapshot of Fuller Seminary. I'm there every once in a while. I accidentally wear the same shirt as I had in my shot here, and I'm glad I didn't do that. So I do have a different shirt on. But I'm there with my wife, Lauren, and then our sons, Will and Theo. And I'm engaged in this work in the church because I feel a calling to it. But much of the work that I do for Fuller Theological Seminary, and that work is researching. So we study churches throughout the U.S. We study leaders. We study younger people. We study worship. We study what's working, what's not working. And then we create books, trainings, articles, things like this to help leaders grow in their own service and mission. And I engage in that work because I feel a calling to it. But more importantly, I engage in that work because I care about the people who make up the church today. And I care about the younger generation who's going to make up the church in the future. And my guess is you could name some people who you care about, who motivate you, whether it's to play an instrument, whether it's to sing, whether it's to plan worship, whatever you do. My guess is it is people, and specifically people who you are close to and care about, who motivate you to do that work. Well, I'm going to zero in specifically on younger people in the church. And I want to start with some data and with a dose of reality. So Max Dupree, who was a well-known business author, passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago. He was also a trustee at Fuller Theological Seminary. He says this: the first job of leaders is to define reality. And as we think about churches that young people love and the implications of that for those of us who lead worship, I want to start with a dose of reality of what's happening when it comes to young people in our churches. The first statistic I want to invite you to consider is this one, that 40 to 50% of youth group graduates drift from God and drift from the church after high school. What that data is pointing to is that of those young people who are growing up in our church, of them end up leaving the faith, end up leaving the church as they get into their young adult years. Now we extend that out from young people a little bit, and what we see is that there is really no major Christian tradition in the United States today that is growing. The vast majority are either flatlined, in decline, but there's no major tradition that's growing in the US. The US is also becoming more ethnically diverse, a bit faster depending on the part of the country that you live in. But this is happening across the United States. In the year 2020, half of young people under age 18 identified as people of color. And in 2055, the US will have no single racial or ethnic majority. What this is putting in front of us is that we are living in a world and a church that is going to be defined by change, especially changing demographics, changing composition, changing ethnic background, changing ages. Well, you put all this together, and what we see is that there are about 1 million young people every year in the United States who are leaving the church. 1 million young people are drifting from the faith annually. We at the Fuller Youth Institute believe that we're in a very unique time, a very unique window for intervention, and that this can actually be our great opportunity to engage the next generation. And a key part of that work is going to happen through our worship. Now, I did not come here just to share bad news with you, to share doom and gloom. In fact, I'm here to share what I think is good news, which is in the midst of some bare spots and some struggles, there are many bright spots of what's happening in the church. We have studied those bright spots in this book, Growing Young. So I'm the co-author of this book, along with my colleagues Kara Powell and Brad Griffin at the Fuller Youth Institute. It's 6 essential strategies to help young people discover and love your church. And we approach these topics from the perspective of research. So what we did was we went out and studied 250 churches in the United States that were thriving in their ministry with young people. And we were asking, why is it that they're doing so well with teenagers and young adults? All together for this research, it took about 4 years. The book came out about 4 years ago, so we're leading this research about 7, 8 years ago. We conducted 1,300 interviews. Our research team spent 10,000 hours collectively on the project. From those interviews, we were analyzing 10,000 pages of transcripts. And when you ask about the diversity of the churches, about half of these churches were not predominantly white. We studied churches under 100 people. We studied churches over 10,000 people from over 20 different denominational backgrounds from all regions of the country. Now, when we talk about a church that's growing young, we would say a church that's growing young is one that is not shrinking and aging. So the average church in the US is shrinking and aging, but a church that's growing young is growing when it comes to involving and retaining young people. Okay, so that's the young part of growing young. These churches have young people. For the purposes of our research, we identified young people as those ages 15 to 29. That is the age group that is least present in the church today. Now that's the young part. The growing part, what we found is that when churches will focus on young people and do it thoughtfully and intentionally, this can bring overall vitality to the whole church. That's the growing part. It doesn't have to be do we choose this group or this group? There's a way of focusing on young people that can bring life, energy, and vitality to the whole church. One of the first things we did when we finished the research was to look at the qualities that your church does not need to engage in to grow young. And some things you can cross off the list. We found that there is no magic size. You don't have to be a big church to reach young people. There's no magic location or region of the country. It's not that young people only show up to church in the Bible Belt, but they don't on the coasts or Midwest or somewhere else. We found churches across the country who were able to engage young people well. Church age, we found there's often a myth that if we're going to engage young people, we need to be a younger church or a church plant. We found churches well over 100 years old who are engaging young people well. Finally, there's an assumption from some out there that young people don't want to be part of a denomination anymore. And we found that's not the case. Young people could really care less if the last part of the church name included Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist. Far and away, young people were looking for a church that was healthy. They were looking for a church that, in their words, took Jesus's message seriously. Now, I'm going to cover about 2 more slides, then I'm going to pause to see if there's any questions. So if you have questions to this point, please do go ahead and type those in, and I will pause in just a second to address those questions. I told you we studied 250 churches. This is one of those churches. It is St. John the Evangelist. It's located in downtown Indianapolis. Now, this is a church with a rich history. It was founded in the 1870s, meaning the church is approximately 150 years old. It had an incredibly rich history over those 150 years. But in the 1970s and 80s, the church began to decline as people started to move out of urban centers and into the suburbs. And this occurred in Indianapolis, just like it did in other parts of the country. And St. John the Evangelist's attendance, which used to number in probably the low 1,000, went down, down, down. It shrunk so small at one point that the church considered closing its doors for good. Thankfully, they decided not to. They decided the church had a life and a future, and they felt like that life and future was going to come from focusing on and investing in younger generations. They brought in a new pastor. Now, this is a Catholic parish, so his name was Father Rick. And Father Rick began over about a 10-year process, a kind of revitalization campaign of that church. And he did not buy into some of those things that I would have told you about previously that you can cross off your list. He wasn't trying to make it just a young church, a hip church. They didn't go from wearing robes to bring in a worship leader who had skinny jeans. That was not their approach. They set about developing what they saw to be a biblical, healthy community. Now, we studied this church around the late 90s is when they kind of reached their the kind of bottom of their dip in attendance, and they were well below 100 people. We studied this church around 2005 2016, started to get to know them right in that time. And they had become a church of about 1,500 total attendees, 1,000 of whom were college students and young adults. And we talked to the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. They had nominated them for this study. And they said, we know of no other church that is as vibrant as this parish in the United States. Now, when you look at what did this church do differently, what did those 250 churches do differently that seemed to lead them to effectiveness with a younger generation? We focus on what we call the 6 core commitments. We talk about these as core because they are essential. They are a core part of the church's culture. And they're not just actions or activities or something that a church did once and felt good about themselves. They were committed to these things. Now, we're going to spend most of the rest of our time walking through this diagram. We call this the growing young wheel. The growing young wheel walks through each of those 6 core commitments. And I'm going to talk you through what those are and what they look like. But I do want to pause for a minute here. So I'm going to stop sharing. I want to pause for a minute here for 2 reasons. Number one, there are handouts. And my hope is that you have been able to find the handouts. I do not actually know where the handouts are. So I'm going to count on, hopefully, either Allison knows, or if anyone isn't able to find them, you can chat that in and we can have some tech support to get you those handouts. That should have both an overview of this growing young wheel diagram, but then it should also have the slides that I am presenting here. All right, so with that, I am just pausing for a minute. I want to see if anybody who is in the meeting has questions on anything that I have talked about so far. So I think you have to chat yourself in. I don't think you are able to ask verbally, but if you are, please do. So again, I will pause for just a minute to see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing anything yet, which is just fine. I have no problem filling the space, but I'll stay paused a minute to make sure there are no questions. Okay, I am not seeing anything come in, so I will keep talking. And then, oh, hey, there we go. All right, Lily. So Lily asking, 40 to 50% of youth group graduates drift from God in the church. Was this referring to high school graduates or university graduates? Yeah, great question, Lily. This one is referring to high school graduates. So those who are part of a high school youth group. There are multiple studies that have been done that have looked at the faith trajectory of those high school students in the 5 to 10 years after they graduate or get out of high school. And that number is conservatively 40 to 50%. There are studies that go as high as 70 to 80%. The lower end of some of the studies is 40%. So we feel comfortable, again, not to be a downer, but if you picture your church and you think about the high school students and younger who are currently there, the best data shows us that 10, 20 years from now, about half of those will still be engaged in their faith. Okay, please do keep questions coming as you have them. Share my screen again, and we will walk through these slides and talk about some of the implications for worship. Someone please cut in if you can't see these. Otherwise, I'm going to hope that you are able to see these slides here. So here's the 6, and I'm going to work my way around clockwise, starting in the upper right-hand corner with keychain leadership. If you have the one-page handout, that it has definitions of each of these, but for keychain leadership, essentially what we're saying is instead of centralizing power and authority, these churches shared the keys. So the idea of keychain leadership is that those who have been in the church the longest are the ones who hold the power and authority in the church. They hold the keys. if we're going to really engage a next generation, we need to focus on sharing the keys with a younger generation, letting them step into authority and responsibility. My guess is you can consider, for those of you who lead worship, it would be common, if you're like most churches, that it is adults and older adults who hold the authority and responsibility and power in the church. One of those questions is, how are we going to share that authority and responsibility appropriately with young people? I will be doing a session specifically on empowering younger leaders later today, if you are signed up for that one. Empathy today, we found that churches that engage young people well empathize with young people. The churches step into their shoes. They understand where they're coming from. Continuing to work clockwise, these churches take Jesus's message seriously. Now, you might say, oh, great, our church, we're all about the gospel. Well, here's part of the challenge. We found a lot of young people who had grown up in churches that would say we are very Bible-based, or we take the gospel seriously. And we found a lot of young people who said, yeah, our church is, they would say they're focused on the Bible. They would say they're a gospel-centered church, but they really don't seem to take Jesus's message seriously. They don't seem to look like Jesus. They don't seem to act like Jesus. Young people wanted to be parts of churches that look and focus on Jesus, look like and focus on Jesus. Working our way around clockwise, we found that these churches are fueled by warm relationships. We found that young people are looking for a place to belong. They're looking for a place where they're known. Continuing to work clockwise, these churches prioritize young people and their families everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that young people were the only priority or the top priority. It does mean that young people were integrated as one of the top priorities. Let's call that in the top 5 or so, maybe top 3, that the discipleship and formation of young people was a focus across the church's priorities. The last one, that these churches know how to be the best neighbors in their community. Young people are passionate about social justice, about seeing God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And when churches engage their communities and their neighbors well, those are often the churches that young people want to be a part of. A couple other qualifiers. I don't want to say that the motivation for these churches was simply to get more young people to show up. The motivation that we saw time and time again in these churches was that they wanted to become a Jesus-centered community. And it was this desire to focus on Jesus that drove them towards these core commitments. You may have also noticed that there's this shaded circle behind the items. I'll go back here. You can see it says context. It's that shaded circle behind. We found that no 2 churches did these things exactly the same way. So the principles were common, but the practice of those principles was unique. And what that means is it can look different in a Baptist church or in a Methodist church or in a Lutheran church or a church in Texas compared to a church in Canada. You always want to pay attention to, yes, the principle is common. We should share the keys. We should display empathy. But the way that we practice that can look different based on our context. Now, you may notice there's this little arrow on the left side that kind of comes out of warm relationships and priority, and it points to growing old. I have to say clearly that at the Fuller Youth Institute, we are not opposed to growing old. We love older people. We think that that's naturally what's going to happen for all of us. We're not referring to individuals here. We are referring to the whole church body. And we believe that what happens to individuals that we age does not have to happen in the church. If we truly believe that the church is the body of Christ, that as our bodies and our buildings are growing older, the average age of our congregation can actually grow younger as we incorporate more and more life and vitality and younger people into our midst. So we are okay with churches having older people. We would say that's it's a great thing to have older people in your church. We don't want the church exclusively to grow old, because if it only grows old, eventually the church is going to die. We need to reinvigorate. We need to ensure we're thinking about our life and future. The reason that comes out of prioritizing young people everywhere is we found that churches often, the rhetoric here did not match their reality. We came across many churches who would say, oh yeah, certainly we make young people a priority because they had Youth Sunday once a year. 1 week out of 52 weeks was Youth Sunday. So they'd say, oh, of course we prioritize young people. Look, we do Youth Sunday. And the question was that the reality of what it looks like to make young people a priority often doesn't match our rhetoric of what we think we're doing to make young people a priority. Now, I want to offer a case study for how these core commitments became embodied in one particular church. And I want to tell you a little bit about their experience for how this happened in worship. So Volga Christian Reformed Church is located in Volga, South Dakota. It's about an hour and a half northwest of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It is a fairly typical Christian Reformed Midwestern congregation. You'll notice that the setup is pretty simple. The architecture is fairly straightforward. This is a pretty small congregation, under 100 people. So it is certainly not, I'll say, a large congregation. Here's what their sanctuary looks like on the inside. So fairly straightforward Midwest Christian Reformed Church. The reality is that about 10 to 15 years ago, Volga Christian Reformed Church was growing old. The average age in the congregation was well past 70 years old. There were a handful of younger people in the church, but they really were not made a priority. They weren't focused on. They really, as we talked to them later on, more recently, they said they really did not love the church in those days. Now, there was one volunteer. Her name was Vanda. Vanda was a public school teacher by day. She was the youth leader volunteer by night and on the weekends. You may be able to tell from the photo, Vanda is closer in age to the middle-aged or older contingent in the church, but really her heart, her passion beat for the young people in the church. And Vanda saw that in worship and kind of across congregational life, that young people were not being made a priority, and she wanted to see them become a higher priority. Now, Vanda could have done what many churches do. And if you lead worship, my guess is you've been through this battle before, and it's a frustrating battle. And I would say it's not really framing the issue in a way that is helpful. Vanda could have gone to the pastor or the worship leader and said, hey, we play too many hymns. The music is too traditional. We need to change the whole thing and make it about young people. And I wish I could see your faces right now, because my guess is that you have been through that whole song of someone coming along and saying the worship service needs to be overhauled. It needs to be drums, guitars, younger music, contemporary, Hillsong, whatever that might mean for you. Well, the reason I'm bringing this story up is that is not the approach that Vanda took. Vanda knew that if she was going to advocate for a younger generation in the church, she could either start a fight or she could figure out a healthier, sustainable way to make this happen. And it was that healthy, sustainable approach that Vanda was after. So Vanda did a few things. Instead of starting that fight to change worship style, she started something called Bridge Sundays. A Bridge Sunday was any time there was a fifth Sunday of the month. And on that fifth Sunday of the month, what they would do is the church sanctuary was upstairs in the building, and they had a basement where their fellowship area was. And on those fifth Sundays after worship, they would go downstairs, they would share a meal together, a potluck. And I know, because I actually have a shot of that potluck. You'll notice it's in the Midwest because there's a lot of potato salad and other types of salads and casseroles. They would share a meal together, and over that meal, they would spend time getting to know each other across generations. So simply building relationship and having community. Vanda decided to introduce some of her friends to the younger people in the church. This is Trudy. Trudy was in her late 80s, early 90s, and Trudy was a golfer. And Vonda decided to have Trudy go along with the youth group on a golf outing. And the teenagers thought, okay, we hope Trudy can even hit the ball about 20 feet. Well, turns out Trudy's a pretty good golfer. And it was the third or fourth hole that they got on where Trudy sank about a 25, 30-foot putt, and the teenagers went nuts. And they, after that, realized, okay, Trudy's okay in our book. Vonda spent time discipling the teenagers in the church and helping them take their faith seriously and reflect that faith to others. There was a prayer meeting that happened where Vonda had invited older and younger generations together for this prayer meeting. And keep in mind, Vonda's been discipling and helping the younger generation study the Bible and take their faith seriously. And they ended up taking some prayer requests, and Vonda asked the older generation to give the prayer request and the younger generation to do the prayer. And when they started praying, these teenagers began to pray these deep, fervent, passionate prayers, not just the surface level, help them, bless them, make their life better. And it was just this moment for the older generation where they realized that, hey, the younger people in our church, these teenagers, they are passionate about their faith. They want to follow Jesus as well. And it started to shift the view between older and younger generations. One last story that I love that happened in Volga Christian Reformed Church is, I told you Vonda didn't want to start a battle about worship. So what she did, instead of trying to let the young people lead in the main worship service, she said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll have the main worship service upstairs, but then after the main worship service is done, we'll have the teenagers, they can go downstairs with me, and we'll just do a worship rehearsal. They can play music that they like, but it won't be upstairs in the sanctuary. It'll be downstairs in the basement. And so the first Sunday that they did this, worship service ended, and everyone normally went kind of outside on the lawn and had some fellowship time, but the teenagers went downstairs and they began to do a worship rehearsal. One of the adults in the church was alarmed that the teenagers might be playing that ungodly music, as they described it, in the worship area upstairs. But they went in, saw the teenagers were in the basement, came back out, told everyone else it's fine, they're in the basement. Well, about a month goes by. And as that month goes by, people get curious what the teenagers are doing. After the service, a few people started going downstairs to watch the teenagers rehearse. Another month goes by, and it becomes kind of a regular practice for the church that everyone would do the worship service upstairs, and then they would go downstairs and watch the teenagers rehearse, and some started singing along. Well, after a few months, this became enough of a habit that one of the senior adults who was most resistant to any sort of change happening in the worship service said to Vonda one Sunday while they were rehearsing, Vonda, don't you think that we could invite the teenagers to just play one praise song during our traditional service upstairs? And Vonda had seen this coming the whole way through, but she turned to her friend and said, you know what? I hadn't even thought about that. That's a great idea. So the very person who would have been most resistant to a change in worship style, given slow time to warm up to it, given a focus on building relationship, ended up being the one to usher young people to be the ones who could play in the main service. And what started as one song became two songs. What started as two songs became three songs, to the point that when we visited Volga Christian Reformed Church during our study, they had a fully intergenerational kind of mixed, blended style worship service that worked very well for them. And they did that without starting a fight. When we visited, younger people in this once dying church are an active part of it, and making statements like this, walking through the doors on Sunday morning is the best. A Volga church has a life and a future that feels bright, and it engaged worship, but it engaged other parts of their community as well. And I could walk you through, I won't take the time to do it, but I could walk you through how they engaged each of these elements as part of their church's culture. It wasn't just focused on worship, but it wasn't only focused on community. It was kind of across the board, across the culture of the church. Here's a few final comments some advice, and then we will go ahead and take questions for the rest of the time. I can't say enough that this process of growing young and engaging younger people, it is not just about changing youth ministry, but it is in fact about changing church culture. This is where I think your role as someone who leads worship is so important. When I worked in a church and I was the youth leader myself and the worship leader had very clearly defined boundaries. I would focus on everything with young people that happens outside of the worship service. The worship leader would only focus on what happened during the worship service and was not primarily responsible to think about younger people. We were happy in our areas. It worked for us. The problem is it does not build a holistic or healthy church. If we want to build a holistic, healthy church, we have to focus on our church's culture. And I would encourage you to think about who is another volunteer or staff member or area of your church who you might need to collaborate with. Another idea is to identify who in your church might be ready for keys. Now, I've already described keys are areas of power, authority, or responsibility. They are not just physical keys to open doors. Keys are the opportunity to step up and lead. And I would encourage you to start where you are. If you predominantly have adults on the platform, if it is predominantly adults who are leading and making decisions about things, I would just encourage you to think through who might you consider as a younger person who may be ready to take on keys. Now, one element of that can be very low-hanging fruit is the soundboard. Young people, we find, are often gravitate to technology, may be interested in lots of buttons. Could you simply have a younger person who shadows an older person on the soundboard? I would encourage you to display empathy. We find that many churches that struggle to engage young people they put the blame on young people and they say, well, young people, they're so different. They don't listen. They don't do church like we used to. We wonder, how might you be able to step into their shoes? How might you be able to feel with them, to sit on the curb with them, to move past finger pointing, frustration, or judgment? Now, in one of your next worship team meetings, if you're talking about younger people or generations, you can tell if you're being empathetic by paying attention to your language and tone of voice. If you're thinking about younger people and it's mostly frustration or what they don't do, I would ask the question, are you really empathizing with young people? The last one that I would invite you to think about is this principle. We believe at the Fuller Youth Institute that everyone in the church rises when we focus on young people. And too often, we take this us versus them. It's either a focus on older or younger generations. Which one are we going to take? What we found in our research is that everyone rises when we focus on young people, but when we do it well. Now, I'm showing you a pie chart because we talked to a senior pastor in a Methodist church during our research. And he said, look, about 20 years ago, we decided to invest more in young people. And he said, if you think of this like a pie chart or like a pie, if you're just into pie and you're not into math, that's fine. He said it stands to reason that if you give everybody in the church one slice of the pie or each slice of the pie, that if you give anybody a larger slice of the pie, there will be less for everyone else to go around. And he said about 20 years ago, we decided to invest more in young people. We gave them a larger piece of the pie. But we didn't invest in young people apart from everyone else. We did it in a way that would be integrated and connect and serve the rest of the body. And he said what happened, and if you're not looking, please pay attention to this animation. He said what happened over those 20 years is there was not less for everyone else to go around, but he said the whole pie got bigger. Because we invested in young people and families, they brought other young people and families, and eventually they became givers and volunteers. Hey, at one point, they were not very good at singing or that instrument, but over time of trying, they became some of the most accomplished people in our church. So again, the senior pastor said, I truly believe everyone in our church can rise when we focus on young people. So I want to go back, and I'll finish with this, to that opening question. What does the future of your church look like? My hope and prayer for you is that the future of your church does not need to be one of decline or simply aging and having older generations, but the future of your church can be vibrant, can be generational, can capture that energy and attention of all generations. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes, I believe, to have some question and answer around this. And welcome to Andrew from First United Methodist and Waxahachie, Texas. All right, I'm not going to try that again, or I will probably slaughter it. So, and I don't know if it's Conan. So I'm just going to respond to your question. Please do chat in. Anyone else who has questions, do chat those in now, and I will make sure that we address them. But was there an overall reason students were leaving the church? Example, hypocrisy. Yeah, good question. So I would say and I'm glad that I was close on the pronunciation. There are a myriad number of reasons, and I have seen books and heard people say, well, the reason young people are leaving the church is, and then there's one thing. And I would say anyone who attributes it to one thing is oversimplifying the challenge. So the most common areas that we hear from young people, most common responses recently is that the church is too political. And it might be that the church is too political, this direction or that direction. There are a number of beliefs and hot button issues that young people might talk about. We hear a number of young people talking about how the church doesn't address or isn't honest about mental health. There are some young people who have questions about human sexuality and the church's stances on that. A lot of people will say the church is closed-minded or it doesn't take science seriously. There are a number of stated reasons like that. Here is the most common reason that I'm going to, again, this isn't the only reason. Statistically, this is what becomes most common. Very few young people have this moment where they decide, I'm never going to be part of the church again. I've sworn off church. And it's like we flipped a switch where they love the church and then all of a sudden they don't like the church anymore. For most young people, it is a very slow drift from church and faith over time. I think, honestly, it starts in 3rd or 4th grade. It's about the overall environment that when most young people end up getting into later high school or into their college years, they simply find that church is not all that compelling. It doesn't give them all that interesting or meaningful of a reason to be engaged. And I think worship can be a primary example of this, where something we hear from young people is, yeah, I like the worship in my church, but I can listen to Hillsong in my car, or I can go to a concert. So other churches will simply try to entertain young people. I've been to Disney World in the last couple of years, and Disney is better at entertaining young people than your church will ever be. So I think we need to step into some of the depth for what really shapes young people's faith most. Joy, you said, very informative. Thank you. We've talked about having a separate service for young people, but it sounds like all we need to be together and make adjustments there. Joy, very good question. I am going to do a session later called The Dark Side of Intergenerational Worship. And the reason I'm going to do that is if you take the two extreme approaches, one is young people service, older people service, right? And there's kind of two options. The other extreme is we just push everybody together and you've got crying babies and older generations, and we are just all together no matter what. We would be in favor of a nuanced approach. And I would really say, Joy, if you're talking about a separate service for younger people, I would first talk to the young people. We've actually heard from some young people where churches were going to make a separate service for them. And they started the separate service and the young people didn't go. And the young people ended up saying, we were actually never interested in a separate service to begin with. So I would ask them, if you are going to keep everyone all together, a case can be made for that as well. I would just make sure that you're actually incorporating and involving young people in the planning for that. So we have seen blended services go very well, again, if younger people have a voice in it. Question: in the example you gave, the worship styles ended up changing simply through the involvement of students. Is that similar to the other examples that you studied? Yeah, I'm going to say, so there are all sorts of different leadership and change styles here. The messiest ones happen when it is simply one person makes a decision, everyone else has to abide by it, or the committee makes a decision, and you've really put a Band-Aid on the solution, but you really haven't addressed the deeper issue. And worship styles are important. I do not want to pretend like they are not. What we have found for most people, more important than worship style is relationship. And for older generations, the churches that we have seen actually change and do it well, they've helped the older generation have this vision. I heard from a senior adult in a church once, she said, I love traditional music, but I want to have a church that my grandchildren want to worship in. And more than traditional music, I love my grandchildren and I want to have a church that they're going to worship in. Often it is through that relationship and connection that we end up seeing healthy change. Now, if you would say, well, that's not really my job. I'm the worship leader. I'm supposed to plan songs, play an instrument. That's actually part of the problem, that we've got churches now where we have divided things and this is my area and that's area. You need a specialty and a responsibility. But I think some of our most challenging issues require us to connect with people in other volunteer or staff roles throughout the church. Tracy, college students say their friends may be more likely to get involved with a church doing ministry projects in their community, like chopping wood. You're in Appalachia, thank you. Building a structure for a family in need. Have you seen this trend in your research, young people being drawn to a faith community that is actively helping their community? Tracy, 100%. The core commitment that we talk about of being the best neighbors in your community is all about community service and involvement. And in a previous generation, and this is still true for baby boomers, when you look at stats for baby boomers of the primary thing they're looking for in a church, it's about the preaching and worship style. I think data continues to affirm for baby boomers, preaching and worship style is the first thing they'll look at. For young people, it's the sense of community. It's whether they're being good neighbors in their community. It does not mean that worship is unimportant, but worship service is not the primary thing that younger generations often talk about. My church people they're not interested in playing or singing for worship. The young people are not interested. You said you sing hymn and contemporary songs. Yeah, I would say if your invitation to the young people initially is, hey, can you lead worship? Can you play this? Can you sing a song? You may actually need to take a step first of getting to know them, finding out what their interests are, what they care about. That's the step of empathy and connection to really understand why is it that they don't want to lead worship. If all you've done is say, hey, do you want to lead worship? And they said no. And then a month later, hey, do you want to lead worship? And they say no. I would say that's an opportunity where you need to step in and say, hey, can you tell me more? Can you help me understand? So I would really invite you to go to your young people with an open posture and spirit. We have 10 seconds left. I hope to see some of you in a later session. It's wonderful to be with you, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.